Welcome to True Drew Podcast, your source for all things Nancy Drew. I'm your host, Avery, and on this podcast, we'll discuss everything from the Nancy Drew books, to computer games, to movie adaptations, and TV shows. Nothing is off the table. So if you're a True Drew, you'll definitely want to tune in for this podcast. All right. Hello, True Drews, and welcome to another episode of the podcast. This episode, we're going to be talking about the 13th Pearl. Also, I hope you guys are having a good December so far. I hope you're not super stressed with the holidays. I feel like this time of year could be a lot sometimes, trying to get all your shopping done, trying to spend time with family and friends. So I hope you're at least enjoying some of the more fun aspects of the holiday season. So the 13th Pearl is the 56th book in the Nancy Drew series, and I cannot believe that we have finally finished the original Yellow Spines. That's a lot of books, 56 books. I mean, it's been fun covering all these books for the podcast, and don't worry, there's plenty more where that came from. We're going to jump into the Nancy Drew files at some point. We're going to, finish this series because there's the Wanderer editions. I think it goes up to 175 books. So that's pretty exciting. And I'm excited to say I'm actually going to be mixing it up pretty soon. We're going to be talking about some of the original texts versus the revised text that we've been covering for the podcast up to this point. We're going to start talking about some of the TV shows and movies because I have yet to cover some of those. There's just so much exciting stuff coming up for the podcast, and it feels very fitting that it's coming at the end of this year and going into 2025. So I hope you guys are excited about that, and I do want to just throw out another thank you for listening to the podcast. I love getting to talk to you guys on Instagram, which my Instagram is True Drew Podcast. I always love to get DMs from you all talking about your favorite books, your favorite games, and it's just and we've got more of the Her Interactive games coming up on the podcast too. I like to kind of space them out because there's less games than there are books, but don't worry, some of those are coming up very soon also. So on to discussing the 13th Pearl, book number 56. This book came out in 1979, and I didn't remember anything about this book. This one was one of the last ones that I read as a kid. And at that point, I thought, oh, that's all the Nancy Drew books there are, having no idea that there were hundreds of other books out there. So I did not remember what this book was about at all. It was just a huge blank slate for me. But apparently, after doing some research, I figured out that the 13th Pearl is what the game Shadow at the Water's Edge is loosely based off of, and I mean loosely. I think the only thing that they took from this book for the game was that it's set in Japan. Nothing else is similar whatsoever. So first we're going to jump into discussing the cover for the 13th Pearl, and if you ever want to see these book covers, I post them on my Instagram on Wednesdays before the podcast airs on Thursdays. But this book cover is very blue. In fact, the only thing that's not blue on this cover is Nancy herself. She's got the strawberry blonde short hair we've become accustomed to. There's a ryokan in the background with a full moon hovering over it. And then there's this guy. I always thought he was supposed to be a monk or something. I don't know if he's a monk or if he's a member of a cult, but he is wearing a white long gown and he's holding up this flag that has a picture of a pearl in an oyster shell on it. It's really bizarre. So this is the only real book cover that I had to talk about today, but I did find a spoof of it, and these cover spoofs that I've found on Google, these are what inspired me to do my own funny cover spoofs. This one is amazing, but somebody has edited it to say the man protesting avocados. I mean, it does kind of look like an avocado on the flag that this guy is carrying, but that is hilarious. I think it's so funny that people have done these. But the funny cover spoof that I came up with, it's not nearly as good as that one, but I said the mystery of why is that monk holding a flag with a spoon with a P on it? Because it does look like a spoon with something on it. It's just weird looking. If they had made it like a sideways clam with its shell opening and then the pearl inside, I think it would have been oh, okay, that's what it is, but it looks bizarre the way they've drawn it. My apologies, Rudy Nappy. I don't know, I like some of the Rudy Nappy covers, but I do, as a whole, tend to like the Russell Tandy covers a lot better. So I gave this book cover a cover rating of 2 magnifying glasses. It's an okay cover. It's just not my favorite. So now let's go ahead and jump into discussing the characters that we see in the 13th Pearl. So in this mystery, we have Mr. Moto, who is a jeweler. We have Tanya Rossmeyer, who is a jewelry client. Benny the Slippery One Caputi, like, wow, what a name for a gangster. Rosina Caputi, who is his wife. Professor Jojo Mize, who is a pearl expert. Kikichi, I hope I'm saying these names right. Tetsuo, Mr. Moto's brother, Mr. Kampura, and Mr. Taro, who is the president of Worldwide Gyms, and Toshio Mize, who is a brother of Professor Jojo Mize. I still can't get over that one bad guy's name, though, Benny the Slippery One Caputi. Like, I just picture him threatening people, like, hey, you don't mess with Caputi, or bad things are gonna happen, capiche? I just wonder if these bad guys give themselves these nicknames, or someone else does. I mean, obviously, the people writing the books give them a nickname, but like within the story, you know? So without further ado, let's jump into the synopsis for the 13th Pearl mystery. Nancy is given an interesting case by Carson. A local jeweler, Mr. Moto, has had a valuable pearl necklace of a customer's go missing. She, Bess, and George go to talk to him, only to witness another jewelry theft. Mr. Moto soon goes missing, and Nancy thinks he's been kidnapped. The company, Worldwide Gyms, starts to look suspicious, and Nancy and Carson follow their leads to Japan, where they are stalked and receive threatening notes of a numerical nature. Nancy eventually discovers a crazy pearl cult, locates the stolen jewelry, and solves the mystery. So the newspaper headline synopsis that I came up with is Jewelry Thieves Captured, Crazy Pearl Cult Exposed. Okay, so this book is crazy. We're not dealing with a fictional cult anymore. This is a real cult. I mean, back in The Secret of Redgate Farm, we had the Black Snake Colony, which was a fake cult, but they were making themselves appear to be a real cult in order to hide their counterfeit money scheme. But this is a legitimate cult. It's crazy. So I took a lot of notes for this one, so let's go ahead and discuss. So the first thing that I took note of was Nancy asks Bess and George if they want to try some pearl powder. This is how she opens up her, hey guys, I have a mystery conversation. But I thought this was so weird. But apparently pearl powder is thought to have benefits for your hair, nails, and oral health. I had never heard of this. But then again, I live in the Western world. Like there's, if it doesn't come in a bottle, we don't tend to, it seems like there's just not many natural remedies, or you have to search them out because the pharmaceutical industry here in America is, basically they all about that money. So I just thought that was kind of interesting. But anyways, Carson has a case for Nancy. A local jeweler named Mr. Moto has had jewelry of his and a client stolen. So Nancy, Bess, and George decide to go talk to him about it. And while they're at his jewelry store, they witness a man running out of the store with more jewelry. I love how Nancy is always in the right place at the right time. So Mr. Moto comes out from the back of the store, and he's completely unaware of what has happened. And so Nancy describes the thief to him, and it turns out that a necklace was taken. So of course Mr. Moto is really upset about this, and Nancy takes this chance to ask about the original theft, and Mr. Moto says the 13th Pearl from his client Tanya Rossmeyer's necklace was stolen. And he goes to show them the necklace to be like, yeah, look, see, it's missing from the setting here. But then he realizes that the entire necklace is fake, and he faints. Also, side note, I don't know if you guys could hear that helicopter just then, but it's been flying over my neighborhood, and I'm kind of wondering, like, is it going to land on my house and create a downdraft in my fireplace like that helicopter in 99 Steps? Because I don't know what they're doing. But anyway, so Mr. Moto has fainted on the floor, and Nancy finds heart medication in his pocket, and so she gives it to him, and when he revives, he tells her his suspicions about a company called Worldwide Gyms. And it's right after he's finished saying this that a strange voice out of nowhere says, "You'd better forget the whole thing if you value your life." So someone was listening in on them, which is very creepy, but Bess mans the shop while Nancy and George investigate this bodiless voice. And when they go in the alleyway and the street, a woman in an upper window answers Nancy's questions and said she saw a stocky man in a gray suit take off down the street. So they get a clue from another woman who said she thought the guy was Italian. I don't know how she surmised that just by looking at him from an upper window, but there you go. I mean, this kind of has some stereotypical connotations to it. I don't really know, but maybe because he was wearing a nice suit. Like, I don't know. It doesn't really explain. So Nancy and George are out in the street chasing leads on this guy, and meanwhile, Bess is being harassed by a blonde woman asking for Miss Rossmeyer's address back in the jewelry store. So she won't give her name to Bess, and Bess is like using the instructions Mr. Moto gave her earlier. He said, hey, if you have any trouble, just push this button under the counter to snap a picture. And so she takes a picture of the woman with a security camera in the shop. I thought this was pretty cool, and I was like, yay, go Bess, because there's nothing more annoying than when somebody like comes into a place where you're working or doing something and they're like, they want all this information from you, but they won't tell you why they want it. And the woman's just being super mean to Bess and aggressive. So Bess is like, I'm not going to give this woman's address to you until you tell me why you want it. And it's for everybody's safety. And also there's these weird things going on. Things have been stolen from this shop already, so it's valid. So when Nancy and George finally get back, Bess tells them what happened, and they take the picture that they took of the woman to Chief McGinnis, and he says it's Rosina Caputi, wife of Benny the Slippery One Caputi, some underworld characters. So Nancy files this information away, and she's like, maybe the guy in the gray suit was Benny Caputi. We don't know at this point. It's just a speculation. So next up in the mystery, they go to see Professor Jojo Mize, who is a specialist on Japan and pearls, because, this 13th Pearl was stolen from Mr. Moto's shop, and Chief McGinnis recommended they see this guy. So the professor has a tortoiseshell cat he calls a Mykoniko, I think is how you say that. I'm probably butchering this, but anyway, he says it was believed they were a charm against shipwrecks. And I said, yeah, Nancy needs one of these. Like, forget Togo, Nancy needs a cat that will ward off boat accidents. Speaking of Togo, Nancy actually brought Togo along to visit with the professor, but she leaves him in her car. I don't know why she does this, but for some reason, he comes barking at the door, and Nancy lets him in, and of course, he starts to chase this cat. They break a vase, like, chaos ensues. I love how Togo can always be counted on to create, like, just absolute havoc in Nancy's life. Like, he's super cute, but he's always getting into stuff too. But Nancy's, of course, very embarrassed, and she apologizes and is like, let me buy you a new vase, and the mices are like, no, it's fine. So after Nancy, Bess, and George have talked to the professor, they go back to Mr. Moto's store again, and they find out from some guy named Kikichi that he left unexpectedly for Japan, and the back room is a mess. And Nancy goes back to investigate it. It looks like someone has torn it apart looking for something. So I'm not gonna lie, when I got to this point in the book, I was like, okay, Kikichi, you are like suspect number one. You show up out of nowhere. Mr. Moto has disappeared. This room is just in shambles. Like, you're not looking too good right now, bud. So Nancy goes out in the street and she finds the same lady who was in that upper apartment building who helped her last time, and her name is Mrs. Rooney, and she says she didn't know Mr. Moto was leaving, but apparently he has a brother. I love little old ladies like this that are like the neighborhood watch. Like, they are so insightful and so helpful when it comes to like finding missing people, or just if you need any information on anyone, they can tell you. But Mr. Moto's brother is named Tetsuo, and he apparently lives in Tokyo. So Nancy starts to investigate the alleyway after she's looked at the room that's just torn apart, and she finds rising sun, like the Japanese flag emblem, tire tracks, which I was like, okay, that's kind of cool. Like, I'm just trying to picture like a tire track with an American flag on it. Like, that just seems very extreme. There's probably a reason they don't do that. It's cool, don't get me wrong, but it seems like a lot of effort to go to just make tire tracks that look like that, but it is a good clue. So Nancy goes to this local garage to ask around, and they say there's a man named Mr. Campura who has a car with tires like that. So Chief McGinnis actually tells Nancy he works for Worldwide Gems. It's all coming full circle now. So Nancy and Carson get to go to Japan, which I was excited about. I love whenever Nancy gets to travel anywhere because I live vicariously through Nancy. And they are on the same flight that Mr. Campura is on, the one that owns that car. So they page him and hide to see what he looks like. So then Mr. Campura comes up to the flight desk and Carson makes the comment to Nancy. He says, "That man looks mean and cruel and I don't want you anywhere near him." I mean, in Mr. Campura's defense, like, I would be very annoyed if somebody called me up to the flight desk and then they're not there. But apparently, he's very sinister looking. And I thought it was really funny. We learn a little tidbit of information about Carson in this chapter. Campbell is Carson Drew's middle name, and he goes by Campbell Drury when he wants to go incognito. I kept wanting to say Campbell's soup for some reason, but yeah, Carson Campbell Drew. Who knew? So the next note that I took down, the Drews stay in Japan with Professor Mize's brother and wife, and they go to see Mr. Campura, and Miss Mize disguises Nancy in traditional Japanese attire and a wig. So Mr. Campura doesn't suspect a thing, but says he doesn't know a Mr. Moto and Miss Rossmeyer has died. Suspicious. So Nancy feels like he's deliberately lying to them, so she calls a friend who is a society reporter, and she says Miss Rossmeyer is very much alive. So why would Mr. Campura tell us that she's dead? So it's directly after this that Nancy also gets a note that is kind of threatening, or it doesn't seem threatening at first because it just says 4 + 9 = 13. And Mr. Mize says 4 is bad luck in Japan and means death. And Nancy wonders if this has anything to do with the 13th Pearl. Now, like I said in the synopsis, Nancy gets a lot of notes that are of a numerical nature. They're not like outright threatening unless you understand like the Japanese culture and background, but I don't know. That would be annoying to me. I hate math. I hate algebra. Like, it's not my thing. So if people started sending me notes with numbers, I'd be like, what? What do you want? Please leave me alone. I'll do anything you want. Just stop sending me notes with numbers. So next up in this mystery, Nancy and Carson get pearl jewelry for Hannah, Aunt Eloise, Bess, and George. And Nancy also gets some cufflinks for Bert and Dave and a stick pin for Ned. According to the book, Bess and George gave Nancy some money so she could bring back something from Japan for their boyfriends. And also, Nancy must still be pretty embarrassed about breaking that vase, and so she gets a vase to replace the one that Togo broke at Professor Mize's. Sorry about your vase. Love Togo. The next note that I wrote down is Nancy, Carson, and the Mizes try to find Mr. Moto's brother Tetsuo, but apparently he's disappeared too. There's a lot of people that go missing in this book, now that I'm thinking about it. The next note that I wrote down, the seaplane that takes Nancy and Carson to this pearl farm almost crashes, and the pilot says the engine looks like it's been tampered with. So Nancy gets another note with 4 + 9 on it. So she's thinking, oh no, someone has literally tampered with this plane because we're getting closer to solving this mystery. Now, we've been getting a lot of threats in this mystery, but we do get to do some fun sightseeing because everyone goes to Nara Park and they see the deer and a giant Buddha statue. And it's while they're there that Nancy sees a man that fits Benny Caputti's description, and he's taking her picture, and so she runs after him. And then while Nancy is in hot pursuit of him, a fake guard comes up and tries to stop her, and he's like, "Why are you chasing this man?" And Nancy has him arrested by a real guard because he's impersonating the guards that are there at the park. That really backfired on that guy. The next note that I wrote down, Professor Mize calls from River Heights, and he says Mr. Moto's entire shop was ransacked back in River Heights, and Kikichi was knocked out. So it's at this point that I started thinking, okay, well maybe Kikichi isn't so bad. I mean, it would be really smart of him to get someone to knock him out, and then he could seem really innocent, and he's not. But he ends up being a nice guy. He's not part of this ring of jewel thieves. So the next thing to happen, Nancy is called down to police headquarters to identify this woman in Tokyo, and it's Rosina Caputti. So the police have Rosina walk across this room so Nancy can identify her, and Nancy is hiding behind this paper screen. And so Rosina feels like somebody's watching her, and so she comes around the screen and attacks Nancy. This woman is absolutely vicious. Like, she grabs Nancy's hair and is trying to like hit her, and so the police pull her off of Nancy, and Nancy like positively identifies her. She's like, yeah, I know that fist that just hit my face. It's Rosina Caputti. And so this is kind of just creepy because the Caputis have followed them from River Heights all the way to Japan. So it's after this whole episode that Nancy ends up getting more threatening phone calls, and Miss Mize is the one who answers them because Nancy's not at home at the moment. And the person says, "Tell the Drews 4 + 9 still equals 13. I just had to laugh at this. I was just like, it just sounds like, I know you are, but what am I? Or just like, find the X. Like, I don't know. That's a pretty reasonable threat. Like, if somebody gave me an algebra problem and they're like, find X, I'd be like, no. Dear math, grow up and solve your own problems. So next up, Nancy and Carson go to see Kabuki Theater, which is really cool. And Nancy asks why the actor leaves his shoes facing the house and the actress leaves hers facing away from the house. And Miss Mize says it's a cultural thing. A man owns the house, therefore he turns his shoes towards the house, and his wife is only a guest, so she turns her shoes outward facing. Excuse me, what? Like, I know this is like an older cultural thing and like hopefully still is not a current thing in Japan, but I was like, okay, hold up. Like, do guests have to clean the house then? Do guests have to cook in the house? Generally upkeep and make the house look nice? I'm going to remember this. So the next thing that I took note of is Nancy, Carson, and the Mizes have a green tea ceremony, and I had a basic understanding of what this was like because there's a local Asian festival that I go to every year. It's in August, and it's really cool. Every Asian country is represented: Japan, China, Singapore. It's very cool, but I got to sit in on a green tea ceremony, and it was just neat seeing all the different whisks and the different traditions that come along with that. It also made me think of the game Shadow at the Water's Edge. We have to do that whole puzzle with Takai where we name the different instruments that are used in green tea ceremonies. So it's after this that Nancy goes to sleep and wakes up to her name being called, and someone says, "Have the prisoner released from jail and go home." So she jumps up and she sees someone out the window who looks like Benny Caputi running away. So basically he's threatening her, like, you got my wife arrested, go get her out of jail. And the next morning, the Mizes show Nancy and Carson a newspaper at breakfast, and more local jewelry has been stolen. So the crime ring is still strong and operating. So Carson is starting to get a little bit worried about the safety of everybody since Benny Caputi was literally at Nancy's window the night before. So this guy named Mr. Natsuke, aka Mr. Button, his name literally means button, like his ancestors made them. But he's a guard that the police have sent to watch the Mizes' house so they feel a little bit safer. And Nancy shows him the gray suit fibers that she found near her window, footprints, and a quarter she found under her window. Benny Caputi wears a gray suit, and the quarter is, American currency. So Nancy's like, yeah, I mean, it's just evidence further pointing out that it was him last night. So after this, Nancy and Miss Mize go to get their hair done for a wedding that they're going to attend, and they are followed by another car. So Nancy points out, hey, I think we're being followed, and Miss Mize loses the car by doing some maneuvers. And while they're getting their hair done, Nancy overhears Miss Rossmeyer canceled an appointment there, so apparently she gets her hair done at the same salon that they're at. This is just further proof that Mr. Campura was lying when he said that she's dead, because dead women don't get their hair done more than once. So Nancy starts following this rabbit trail, and she figures out that Miss Rossmeyer was actually going to Rome, and she had jewelry that was stolen from her, and her cab driver, the prime suspect, whose name is Joe Slate, has gone missing very conveniently. And later, Carson finds out Joe Slate visited Rosina Caputi in prison. So all of these things are connected. So Nancy and Carson go to the wedding with the Mizes, and Nancy gets another arithmetic threat. But then, after this, she sees a man stealing jewelry from the people at the party. But when she confronts him and he turns out his pockets, they're empty. So naturally, Nancy's really embarrassed about this because she's called attention to it, and now this guy turns out to have nothing in his pockets. But she's like, I could have sworn that I saw him stealing jewelry. So the security guard has Nancy turn out her pockets and he searches her kimono sleeves and he finds jewelry hidden there. So that guy obviously planted these jewels on Nancy to divert suspicion from himself, but the Mises quickly vouch for Nancy's character and she's free to go. The next note that I took down, everybody goes to Worldwide Gems again and talks to Mr. Taro, and he insists that the company is a reputable one. But Nancy speaks to his secretary in the bathroom, and she says she thinks Mr. Taro is unaware of the bad people mixed up in his own company. So it could be a case where Mr. Taro is completely innocent and there's all these bad eggs within his own company. But it's just, that always bothers me when this happens in books or movies, because I'm like, this person's like a nice person, and then these other people are taking advantage of them, using their business and their name to be corrupt. So this next thing that happened frustrated me so much. But Mr. Mize, the guy that Nancy and Carson have been staying with, they've been staying with the Mises in Japan, he just conveniently remembers now, at the very end of the mystery, oh yeah, I think I have stock in Worldwide Gems. Like, dude, where have you been? We've only been talking about this company since we got here, since we got to Japan, and now you remember what's in your stock portfolio. Well, okay then, better late than never. Thanks for finally being helpful. I mean, he's been helpful, but still. Mr. Mize goes and gets this list of chief officers for Worldwide Gems, and it turns out that Miss Rossmeyer is one of them. So Nancy wonders if she's in on the jewel stealing racket or if she's innocent like Mr. Taro might be. And then Mrs. Mize takes this opportunity to show everybody this article saying, Miss Rossmeyer had a necklace stolen, which, I mean, at this point, I wasn't sure if Miss Rossmeyer was being used or if she was actually part of this racket, because you could easily have somebody steal a necklace of yours and then later you, claim the insurance money or whatever. I wasn't sure how this mystery was going to go, so that part did keep me in suspense. This next note that I took down is just funny. We learn a little bit more about the Japanese wildlife, and Carson is fascinated by stories about the cormorant birds. I think that's how you say that. And according to a local fisherman that they talked to, they said they used to tie a string to them, and when they'd swoop down to grab fish, the fishermen would steal the fish from them. And I said, well, dang, if that isn't just a metaphor for life. You teach a man to fish, more like you sucker someone else into doing the hard work for you, then swoop in and take the credit. I'm not speaking from personal experience or anything. So the next thing that happens is Mr. Moto is spotted in the back of a car in River Heights. That guy who's been missing for the majority of the mystery. So Nancy and Carson decide to go home and investigate this lead. And Carson says, it's high time we get back and take up our work. You never stopped working. If there's anybody other than Nancy Drew that knows the value of hard work, it's Carson Campbell Drew. Now, we also find out at this point that Miss Caputi got out of jail thanks to Mr. Campura. Dun dun dun. So he, I guess paid her bail and got her out. It pays off to have friends in low places. So everyone's back in River Heights now, and Nancy decides to give Hannah, Ned, Bert, Dave, Bess, and George all the presents that she got for them. And then she gets a call, and the person says Miss Rossmeyer and Mr. Moto are having a party, and they want her to come. And the password she has to give is 12 and 13. Red flags everywhere. Mr. Moto has been missing, and all of a sudden he is extending party invitations. It doesn't add up. So Nancy and Ned stay up talking after she's given him the gift, and they've talked about this party invitation. And a man and a German Shepherd burst through the front door of the Drews' house. So the man yells at Nancy and Ned and says, this is your final warning. And then the dog corners Nancy and Ned behind the couch. But this is when Hannah Gruen comes and saves the day. So Hannah starts hitting the dog with a broom, and then she throws water on it. And I just love how Hannah is always saving Nancy from dogs. There was another book where she used a hose on a German Shepherd or some kind of dog that attacked Nancy in the front yard. Hannah does not play around. Hannah Gruen deserves not only a vacation, but a raise. So the next thing that I wrote down is Nancy and Ned go to the party that they've been invited to, and they notice that everyone is wearing pearl necklaces. And they see Miss Rossmeyer, and Ned says she's decked out like a Christmas tree with jewels. I'm just picturing this woman with every available finger covered in rings, and she's got earrings and just necklaces and bracelets all up and down her arms. And yeah, apparently Nancy and Ned didn't get the memo. Like, they don't have pearl necklaces, so I guess they stick out like sore thumbs. But then the book says Nancy is disappointed that Miss Rossmeyer isn't pretty. I said, why does that matter? She could be a criminal. Like, why do we care what she looks like? I just thought that this was an odd comment for Nancy to make. So Nancy and Ned end up going upstairs in this house where the party's being thrown, and they find a woman rocking on a bed, muttering to herself, and she's saying, moon, high tides, beautiful shell, lovely pink. And Nancy begins to wonder if this is a pearl worshipping cult. I mean, she's right. It is. It's the only logical conclusion that you can come to. But I'm just like, what in the world? Like, this was so bizarre. But Nancy says that her name is Nan Drury, and she introduces Ned as Edward Nixon to the other members of this cult. I love that Nancy took a page out of her dad's playbook because his alias was Campbell Drury, and Nancy's just like, yeah, my name's Nan Drury. Like, it's not different enough, Nancy. But anyways, a man says that Miss Rossmeyer wants to speak to them privately, but then he ends up locking them in a hallway, and Carson, apparently before Nancy and Ned left the house, gave them universal keys, and they used one to get out. I said, I don't think that's how that works. Like, I'm not a locksmith, but this doesn't seem... This doesn't seem possible, but we will go with it for the sake of this book. So once Nancy and Ned are free from this hallway that they're locked in, they go to a newspaper office and ask to see a picture of Miss Rossmeyer because Nancy's just like, I don't know. I guess she's trying to figure out if the woman they met at the party is the real Miss Rossmeyer or a fake Miss Rossmeyer. But a part of me was just like, is she just obsessed over the fact that, like, oh, she's not pretty enough to be the real Miss Rossmeyer? But it turns out that the woman at the party was a fake. The real Miss Rossmeyer is in Paris, and the cult broke into her house. So I guess the house they were just in was Miss Rossmeyer's. So Nancy and Ned bring the police back to the mansion, then follow the last car to a barn where they find the cult people again, and they overhear Mr. Campura and Benny Caputi talking about what they're going to do with Mr. Moto. So of course, Mr. Moto didn't initiate or send that invitation. He is just still, he's been kidnapped. He's still being held somewhere. He has nothing to do with this cult other than just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But they see the weird cult people bowing to an altar of pearls, and so then Nancy and Ned leave, and then they get drugged by people in the woods, and then when they wake up, they're with Mr. Moto, and the police show up, and all the cult people flee, and they're screaming for their pearl goddess. It's just so bizarre. I was like, what on earth is this mystery? It's so weird. So yeah, that is the last note that I took down for the 13th Pearl. So we'll go ahead and jump into the What's Cooking with Hannah Gruen segment of this podcast. So in this book, Hannah made lemon meringue pie, which is apparently Carson's favorite dessert. Who knew? Green tea, broiled eel, and rice. This is some of the things that we see Nancy and Carson eat while they're in Japan. And then there's also fish, rice, vegetables, sake, and a peach cake made by the Mises Maid Haruka, and green tea and bean and sugar cakes. I really want to go to Japan, not just for the food. I want to go just for the culture and to see it and experience it. Like, it is in my top bucket list of places to go. So for the things that I said Nancy could add to her resume for this episode, Nancy became an expert in Japanese culture. She got to see kabuki theater, go to a green tea ceremony. She got to dress in traditional Japanese attire, so she's definitely an expert. And she's a cult infiltrator. She went to the mansion at this party and just, oh my gosh, I just still can't believe it. This has got to be one of the weirdest Nancy Drew books. Now let's discuss the things I liked and the things I didn't like about the 13th Pearl. So I really liked that Nancy gets to go to Japan in this book. I liked that she gets to learn about the culture. I liked the weird cult, honestly. It was kind of bizarre, and it was just like, really? Are there people out there that worship pearls? I don't know. But it was interesting, I'll give it that. The things that I didn't like about this book, there's a lot of people in this book. Like, there was so-and-so's brother, and then this other brother. It was a lot to keep up with, so sometimes a lot of characters like that kind of bog a mystery down for me. And they were a little more respectful in this book, but there were still some places where they'd say the Japanese. Like, they handled it a lot better than the Leaning Chimney mystery or the Mystery of the Fire Dragon, but it was still kind of like towing that line. So as far as a book rating goes for the 13th Pearl, I gave this book 2 magnifying glasses because, the parts in Japan were actually really enjoyable, but some of this mystery was just weird. I don't really know how else to put it. So yeah, that concludes today's episode, and I know you guys are going to be excited about this because I've been talking to people on Instagram about this for a while. But for next week's episode, we're going to jump into The Secret of the Old Clock, the original text, because we've been doing the revised texts up to this point for the podcast, and I thought it would be cool to go back and compare with the original text. So I will see you guys for that episode next week. Until next time, thank you for listening to this episode of True Drew Podcast. Can't get enough of the podcast? Then check out my subscription series, True Drew Files, available on Apple and Spotify. For Nancy Drew books and merchandise, you can check out my website, www.truedrewpodcast.com. For business inquiries, you can contact me at truedrewpodcast@gmail.com, or you can connect with me on Instagram at True Drew Podcast.